We are recording this, which will be, it will be on the DC LERA webpage for your future viewing pleasure. I'm Steve Slay, the president of DC LERA, past president of National LERA, and we are being hosted by our National LERA colleagues, Bernadette Tiemann and Emily Smith, and thank you guys for doing a great job as always. DC LERA is a very active chapter of the Labor and Employment Relations Association. We have folks from business, labor, the federal agencies, and uniquely many of the embassies here that are situated here in Washington, D.C. We have members of our board who are on today, and we really encourage you, any one of you, to join up DC LERA. Go to our webpage. Become a member. We have a full slate of presentations being scheduled for 2022. Optimistically in person. I think we'll do the first few both in person and via Zoom. But January 26th, we will be at the Women's Democratic Club in Washington, D.C., and by Zoom listening to Professor Melissa Fisher. And I will be very happy to turn over the reins of the DC LERA chapter to David Jacobs. Professor Jacobs is a stalwart member of LERA and accomplished academic, and will do a great job running the organization in 2022. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our partner in these presentations, Kevin Cassidy. Kevin heads up the U.S.-Canada Office for the International Labor Organization and has been a great partner as we've put together 6 or so webinars around the topic of returning to work. And our hope had been, when we first had this conversation in June, was by the end of the year we would be back to normal. We're not back to normal quite yet. New variants have popped up, and we have to deal with what we have. But with that as a preamble, I will turn it over to Kevin. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Steve. Firstly, I would really like to give a great big thanks to DC LERA for their support and collaboration over these past few years, as well as bringing this key issue to the table for discussion. I'm honored to be included in the discussion and for Jeff Wheeler's efforts in assembling an incredible list of speakers for today's webinar. Supply chains are of specific interest to the ILO as they offer a strategic mechanism for the organization and its constituents to advance decent work in an integrated way, not only in the supply chains concerned, but as an entry point for advancing decent work in the broader sectoral and national context. ILO constituents have discussed supply chains' positive and negative aspects as seen from their respective points of view, though primarily with global supply chains as an explicit or implicit subject. The ILO's 2016 resolution concerning decent work in global supply chains identified the potential of global supply chains to be key drivers of growth, job creation, economic development. They have contributed to economic growth, job creation, poverty reduction, entrepreneurship, and can contribute to a transition from the informal to the formal economy. They can also be engines of development by promoting technology transfer, adopting new production practices, and moving into higher valued activities, which would enhance the skills development and productivity and competitiveness in those countries. Today, you're going to hear from experts who are fully engaged in addressing forced labor and other key issues in the global supply chain discussions. I am really looking forward to hearing of their work and their perspectives. So at this time, I would like to pass the mic to our moderator, Jeff Wheeler, for today's discussion. Jeff, over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you for joining us, Kevin. And thanks for the ILO's engagement and sponsorship of this event. And also thanks to the Labor and Employment Relations Association, including the national organization, with Emily and Bernadette's able help in us being able to set up this webinar. And also to the DC Labor and Employment Relations Association chapter. Steve is our president and I'm one of the board members. Stay tuned. There are a lot of other good programs and activities that the DC LERA puts on in the National LERA, including addressing supply chain issues. So please stay tuned. We have a wide range of really interesting and accomplished participants from around the globe that are signing on to this conversation. And I'll have to say this is a start of a dialogue on a range of very important and interesting issues. What I'd like to do is just very briefly introduce our project, the Global Trace Protocol project, identify what are a few overarching key questions, and then do a quick introduction of the speakers. And how we're going to organize this is we'll have about 15 minutes for each of the speakers, followed by 10 minutes of discussion with Professor Janice Bellacci. And then we'll allow the speakers an opportunity for any kind of comment and follow up. And then we'll have about a half-hour Q&A that we will have at the end. And I don't know, Bernadette, if you're able to pull up my PowerPoint real quick. If not, I can just go ahead and talk.
I don't think I have it, Jeff.
Okay, I was having some issues with sharing. So very briefly, let me see if I can pull it up or not. No. Okay. So briefly, I'm the director of the Elevate Global Trace Protocol project, implemented by Elevate Limited, which does a great deal of work on global sustainability and supply chains, ESG services, social responsibility, advisory disclosure services, and assessments, among others. Our project is funded for a period of 4 years by the U.S. Department of Labor, iLab. We have 1 year done, and there's a sister project implemented by Verite in India covering cotton supply chains. Very briefly, the focus of our project, which is very pertinent to what we're doing here, is to improve upstream traceability and global supply chains to help eliminate global forced labor and child labor. And we have a start on child labor and forced labor in the cotton supply chains in Pakistan, and also in the cobalt industry focused on the DRC. And the idea here is that we're developing protocols, adapting from existing ones and building new ones, developing traceability tools that are being implemented. We'll run them as pilots, and then disseminate this information, engage and build stakeholders to engage in that process. And then we're moving towards a commodity agnostic platform in which we build on these efforts in traceability. Just a few broad themes or questions that I'll mention. One is a key issue: how do we direct rapidly changing technology to address rapidly changing supply chains? There's a lot in motion, a lot that's very dynamic here. The technology tools that we and others are looking at are evolving very quickly, as are global supply chains that are remarkably complex down different industries and among them as well. And so the idea is moving from industry specific towards commodity agnostic, which is difficult, and addressing a range of different what we call chain of custody models, but also addressing this evolution and value chain approaches. And then looking at a range of technology tools, critiquing them, like whether blockchain is useful or the most appropriate or others, and then looking at a wide range of other technology tools like DNA markers to trace products. Another big overarching question is, how do we improve transparency and traceability standards? Moving from confidential and proprietary standards to publicly available ones is a challenge. It's underway, it's in the process, but it's going to require a lot of work. Another area is, are we tracking meaningful key data elements, which is what we refer to for tracking the changes in the product, and the labor rights indicators? And there's always a tension between what we want to collect and what is available and what we can effectively collect, and specifically in particular industries and then among them as well. There are a number of important issues. Alex will be addressing some of them related to unfair recruitment and debt bondage, and how do we address it? And there's a real question too, I think Jason will get into this a bit more about, where does worker voice fit in here? Where does effective organized worker voice and worker engagement play a role here? And then there's a kind of a bigger question for all of us: brands, regulators, civil society, work organizations, and that is, what counts? What's a traceability system that is effective and manageable, that gets the kind of data and information that we need in order to make effective decisions? What's the standard and what's the level of proof that's required by brands, factories, regulators, workers, and civil society? And this is an evolving area, given the evolving technology as well. So what we're going to do is we'll start with Alex Nasri, who is the global coordinator of the Accelerator Lab 8.7, the fundamentals branch of the ILO, and she'll be addressing how to address unfair recruitment. And that'll be followed by Sarah Lewis, the traceability division director at Fishwise, addressing innovation in seafood traceability, and then followed by Jason Judd, the executive director of Cornell's ILR New Conversations Project. We'll be talking a bit about the data problems in progress in work in fishing, and then followed up by our distinguished Professor Janice Polacci, who'll be giving us some comments and overviews and a broader perspective. And then we'll give an opportunity for others to comment on their presentations, and then follow up and make sure that we have time for Q&A, which you can send to me in chat, and then I'll tee them up for that conversation. So with no further ado, let's turn it over to Alex.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. It's a big pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you to DC LERA for inviting me to this panel. I think Emily will share my presentation. So I will start. Let me know, Emily, if you have a problem, and then I can share from my side.
I'd be happy to share that for you. I'm just not sure I have the file.
Okay, let me then do it myself.
You can see it.
Can everyone see it?
Do you have it on full screen, Alex? Good, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, now it's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry for that. So yes, today I want to address an issue that that is linked to forced labor in global supply chains, and that has been a bit under the radar for a while, and that reemerged a few years ago, really has a major issue to look at. And that's the issue of unfair recruitment of workers. So the labor supply chains angle, if you want. Why it's important to focus on this issue when we speak about forced labor and the identification of forced labor, the prevention of forced labor in global supply chains. It's because we have seen, and it has been demonstrated through several studies, both of the ILO and others in the past few years, that when workers enter into an employment relationship through an unfair recruitment process, meaning that either they have paid a lot of fees and costs for their recruitment, or they've been deceived on some of their contractual conditions, then their risk of falling into a forced labor situation increasing drastically. On the contrary, if the recruitment process is done in a fair manner, it does not mean that the working and living conditions will be decent, but there will be higher chances for a successful employment relationship, and it will also give the opportunity to the worker, if the situation becomes abusive, to leave this situation and not be kept through debt bondage. So when realizing this really important link that we need also to look at when discussing what we can do to effectively prevent forced labor in supply chains, now the good thing is that first, it's fully recognized in international labor standards. So in 2014, there's been the adoption of the ILO Protocol 29 on forced labor, which is a protocol that complements an older convention, our forced labor conventions, to really put it, if you want, in a modern era and look at the different issues, the different root causes that are at the core of forced labor. And the protocol really makes a very clear link between if states want to protect effectively workers, especially migrant workers, and I will come back to that, from forced labor, then there needs to be protective measures and make sure that workers do not go through abusive and fraudulent recruitment practices. So this link is there. in a protocol which is part of the fundamentals conventions of the ILO. In addition to that, 2 years later, we had this link, but we wanted really to clarify, okay, what does fair recruitment really means? What does it mean in terms of state responsibilities, in terms of responsibilities for employers and for recruiters? And so through a tripartite meeting of experts in 2016, we adopted what we call the general principles and guidelines for fair recruitment, which is really a great document. I encourage you to have a look, that details and is very clear on the different steps that needs to be taken by each actor to achieve fair recruitment. And in parallel to this, just to give you the full background, we also launched what we call the Fair Recruitment Initiative, to look at how can we support our constituents more effectively through development cooperation to address this issue of unfair recruitment, including in global supply chains context. So on the screen, I wanted to pick a few big challenges linked to this issue that are really key when we want to understand why is it so complex to address unfair labor supply chains. One starting point is really the complexity of the subcontracting models of recruitment, and I will show you one model on the next slides, especially when we look at situations where workers are recruiting transnationally, so migrant workers, which we know, migrant workers are very often employed, sometimes depending on the sector, they are really a majority of the workforce in global supply chains. We see that those subcontracting models of recruitment are very complex. They start with, sub-agents, sub-recruitment agents at the village level in countries of origin of workers, to then a main agent in the capital of the countries of origin that is in link with a main recruitment agents in the country of destination. And then sometimes you have a placement agency and the final employer. So it's quite complex, and that's why there's been some challenges in terms of conducting due diligence of those whole supply chains and making sure that workers do not pay any fees and are not deceived on working conditions throughout this chain. Another challenge is really linked to volume-based business models. What we've seen is the more you deploy workers for a labor recruiter, the more you earn money. And there's often, because of this volume that you need to deploy, often the quality of the recruitment is really decreased. And what we see also is that, for certain sectors, it's been a given that, okay, I need to recruit, 1,000 workers for this project, and I have only 1 month. And I've been managing a few projects in the past on recruitment, and this is often what we see. Employers going with demand of very high number of workers that need to be recruiting immediately. And the thing is, we don't think, okay, if you want to recruit immediately for a labor recruiter on the other side of the picture, it means that you will have to use many intermediaries to get to the worker very quickly, that you will have potentially, to sell the job offer not fully in the correct manner if you want to attract and motivate workers to apply. So it really leads to fraudulent recruitment. Another challenge is also linked to employers and job seekers' behavior and expectations, because if for a long time, some employers were thinking that it was normal for workers to pay for their jobs, it's still also the case on the other side that many workers still expect to pay to be recruiting for a job. And sometimes when we speak with fair recruiters that have fully reformed their recruitment practices, they're telling us, when we go and we advertise for jobs, mentioning that really you shouldn't pay anything to avoid that then you are in debt, workers often do not trust them. They say, you know, there's something behind it, it's not possible. So there's a whole culture and a lot of programs on awareness raising to be done to really counter those beliefs that have been there for a very long time. Of course, the last challenge is also what we see is, I mean, gaps in regulatory and enforcement mechanisms. There are many, I will not cover all of them today, but for example, on the issue of recruitment fees paid by workers, what we see is sometimes incoherences between legislation in countries of origin of workers and countries of destination of workers. For example, countries of origin not prohibiting the collection of recruitment fees while the country of destination would prohibit it, which also creates really a lot of challenges to make sure that workers are not charged along the way. So here I just wanted to show you how a labor supply chain looks like. And this is also to recall that we really need to look at those vertical aspects that have been forgotten for some times, and throughout the supply chains. And here, just want to re-emphasize the fact that the more intermediaries you have in those labor supply chains, the more difficult it is to control that you know, fair recruitment principles are applied, and also to hold to have liability of actors along the chain. So one thing that have been done by some companies that want to achieve fair recruitment is try to see how to cut or to reduce to the maximum the number of intermediaries used, how to move towards, for example, direct recruitment models where you would in fact not forcibly engage with a private employment agency to recruit your workers. It does not mean obviously that every private employment agency is unscrupulous. It just means that the more layers you have, the more difficult it is to control. So in terms of emerging policies and practices, we've seen a lot of progress in the past few years on addressing this issue. There are still a lot of challenges that remain, but a lot of progress have been done. I wanted to mention a few today. So we are seeing a lot of private employment agencies moving to a fair recruitment model, focusing on quality, deployments, making sure that they advertise along the chain that they do not charge recruitment fees, putting in place some direct communication channels with workers so that they can communicate since the start and throughout the recruitment process that you should not charge any fees. So there are those examples. We've seen also in terms of employer-led initiative, the ILO, for example, is engaged and has been engaged in the past few years on piloting initiative in sectors that are in global supply chains. For example, the garment sector. We piloted the pilot between Nepal and Jordan in the garment sectors to try to demonstrate together with recruiters on both sides, I mean, in both countries of origin and destination, and with the employers that fair recruitment is possible. And there's been a lot of improvement in terms of putting in place very serious due diligence process, with also the development of tools. Here, one thing I wanted to mention is that a lot of things that we've been seeing also is that this is the labor supply chain angle is a sector in a way that is very informal. So often in very formal global supply chain, you know, you realize that in fact the recruitment aspect is totally informal. So you hire a recruiter with a service agreement, but this recruiter who is using another recruiter in countries of origin and sub-agent have absolutely no contract, no service agreements with this other recruiter. It's it's word of mouth, which makes it obviously very difficult to put commitments and clear expectations, make sure that there's also a very clear categorization of costs and who are paying for those costs, and making sure that there's also liability for what happened if a worker arrive at employment and is seen to have been charged fees. I mean, what is the process for remediation that needs to be put in place? So there's a lot of improvement on that side. What we've seen, maybe one more example on the government initiative side, is government-led joint liability schemes, which means that it's also putting the onus on recruiters, who in the past were doing potentially, volume-based deployment, to also think, okay, who are the employers who will receive those workers and employ those workers, and what's also my responsibility and my liability as a recruiter when I place a worker into this employer. So we have seen some joint liability schemes emerged, joint liability between the employer and the recruiter. Of course, in terms of implementation, that's still challenging, especially when we look at cross-border recruitment with issues of jurisdiction, but these are promising practices. So now moving to technology, because this is the topic of today, and I think we will hear very interesting examples in the fishing sector afterwards. We've also looked at how technology can support us with ensuring the fair recruitment of workers, ensuring labor supply chains are fully fair. And we just published, in fact, a report, if you're interested to look at it, on the use of digital technology in the recruitment of migrant workers 2 days ago. It's on our website. That is looking really at all the initiatives that happen, and there's been many, to take the potential of digital technology to ensure that workers would not pay any fees, would not be deceived, and that recruitment would be done in a fair way. And you can see on the screen that, in fact, what we realize is that digital technologies can really help us throughout the recruitment process, from the pre-recruitment stage, where you can use phone-based technology, social media, to make sure that workers are better informed, bring really more transparency to job seekers on the conditions of recruitment and working and living conditions that they will get after they accept this job, to the deployment process, for example, in terms of also pre-departure orientation trainings, but also looking at how all the documents during the recruitment process can be kept safely so that workers can have access to them at any time if there's an issue afterwards. And the employment and return reintegration process. So really throughout the chain, there's been the development of many digital technologies that are helping the process. One of the lessons from this report that just came out is that if we want to have effective digital products to prevent forced labor throughout labor supply chains, it has to work on mobile phone, be accessible where connectivity is low or intermittent, so that you are not cut in regions and areas where sometimes the most vulnerable workers, vulnerable to abuse, are living. They need also to feature information from a trusted source. It's something that really comes out very often, is that workers do not trust most of the information they receive. So how do you make sure that you build this trust? Also, that the information needs to be regularly updated and maintained. I think that's a key issue with those technologies, especially those that provide information on rights, obligations, that they become obsolete very quickly. and that also they involves workers in the design from the very start to make sure that it's not top down, but really well calibrated for the needs. So
to mention, we've run out of time. So if you can just kind of wrap it up, and hopefully we can unpack this a bit more in Q&A would be great.
Yes, perfect, Jeff. So here you have a few of the tools that have been developed, and maybe to finish, I wanted to show you one tool that we've been supporting, led by the International Trade Union Confederation. It's kind of a trip advisor for recruitment agencies, where workers can really rate their experiences with different recruiters. Governments are feeding the platform with the list of licensed recruiters. And then, prospective workers can check it out and really see what has been the experiences so far. So that's it from my side. I think to conclude, I want to say that with this Accelerator Lab 8.7 program, one aspect of it is really to try to see how we can bridge the divide between new technologies that address forced labor in many different forms, including the fair recruitment aspects. And yeah, really looking forward to discuss with all of you today those important developments. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much for giving us a concise overview of some of the complex issues on unfair recruitment. And you've also touched on a number of themes that I think will resonate with others on global supply chains. So for those of you that have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, and we're going to tee them up for the end of the presentation. We're not going to get into them right now, but save those questions. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Sarah Lewis of Fishwise. Fishwise has been doing a lot of really interesting cutting edge work, and is a real leader in this field. So Sarah, if you were able to pull up your presentation, that would be great.
Yes, I was trying to do some fancy partial screen sharing thing. So let's see if I can do that really fast.
And you're always welcome to talk too, whatever works best for you.
Yeah, it's just hard to get to full screen here. So hold on one second. Here we go. And then I'm going to.
And I'll raise a finger when you have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to keep my eyes on you. It's hard to sort of do both here. Is there a presenter view option? I'm not seeing it, so I'm going to go full screen and hopefully you'll see that at least. Are we good?
Yes, your slides are nice and big and readable.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm Sarah Lewis. I'm the Traceability Division Director at Fishwise. And so I think I'll start our little conversation just explaining what Fishwise is, and hopefully that'll provide some context as to how I'm coming at this work. But we are a small nonprofit seafood consultancy. We're an NGO and a consultant to companies. And our mission is to sustain ocean ecosystems. So we really started out in the space of seafood from an environmental perspective, but we've grown our work to include both the people who depend on the ocean systems and the environment. And in doing so, we are sort of dividing our work into 3 concentric circles that we hope build on each other to help us scale our impact. The first core part of our work is direct supply chain engagement. And so 18 years ago, we started off with retail partners in North America, trying to basically transition their seafood procurement to be more sustainable. And that work has grown to now being, I will share some stats in a moment, but has grown to being just one of many of the aspects of our work that we do within this space. The next level, after we began that work with individual companies, we quickly realized that we were not working with the only companies that had these issues. And in fact, it would be really effective if we worked together with NGOs and industry initiatives, as well as government initiatives, to pool our efforts and align on our messages about what changes were needed. So that's the second one. And then, of course, the government direct work where we do advocacy, but mostly our approach to that is to connect the industry stakeholders to help support them advocate for their needs, and really trying to be a convener of conversations around what good management of both environmental and labor policy could accomplish, and what people's various needs are in that space. So the market implementation piece, as I said, it's grown from one small retailer in California, which is where we're based, to really a global reach. We have over 150 million pounds of seafood that we are tracking for both sustainability and labor risks throughout our partnerships. We have suppliers, to 450 suppliers that we work with and communicate. We operate with supply chains within 52 different countries and over 4,000 storefronts just for retail. We also have hospitality and distribution partners. So this work within the global seafood industry has really given us a lot of insights into the complexity of the supply chains that exist, as Alex just discussed, as well as the complexity of the issues that they're facing and their scope of resource to be able to tackle some of these issues. So we work with large companies and small, and we need to come up with solutions that work for both. One of the ways that we're tackling that piece is also through one of our multi-stakeholder and government efforts, which is the SALT initiative, which stands for the Seafood Alliance for Legality and Traceability. This is a USAID funded project that really looks to convene those practitioners in the traceability and seafood space to begin discussing in a global context how to empower seafood sector to adopt electronic traceability, traceability being essentially the technologies needed to exchange information up and down the supply chain, and to know that whatever good or product you have, in fact, you can look back and verify its origin and attributes. So it's really a key tool in the toolbox to empower improved regulation of fisheries, improved labor oversight and monitoring, and incentivize technology adoption that makes business run smoother as well. So this SALT initiative has been going for about 3 years now, and I'll get into a little bit more of the outputs of this work, but it is a global convening of experts and organizations to try to really think through the issues related to seafood. And you'll notice the lower right-hand box here. And it does include what we call a comprehensive definition of sustainability. So we are looking at how traceability can support human and labor rights within seafood. And we don't want to approach that. And I say I'm speaking for our community, not just for Fishwise. We've really worked within this group to think about how we don't necessarily separate environmental and human rights into separate scopes of work, but rather there are differences between what's needed for both, of course, but where we can leverage tools like traceability to provide benefits for both, we'd like to do that. And the focus of this organization, of our efforts to organize our resources, is really the producer country governments. So while there is industry involvement and industry implications of a lot of this work, we're really thinking about how to support the governments of small or developing nations to implement traceability to help their products get to market and help folks to really understand how to implement these traceability practices effectively. So I will then move on to what I'm hoping to cover today. I'm coming to you as sort of both a practitioner within the traceability space, having worked with many companies directly on this topic, but also as somebody that focuses, as I said, on this sort of bigger picture and collaboration around data and these issues. So I'd like to discuss just really briefly, since we've already had an excellent introduction to this, the evolution of human rights efforts in seafood specifically, and then some emerging guidance, initiatives, and lessons learned. So really fast, a primer on seafood, because this is not an area where a lot of folks might be familiar within the labor space. These challenges are often defined as stemming from traditionally increasing demand on ocean resources, which lead to overfishing. Now, this is a simplistic definition, but this is just giving you some context of what are the pressure points that are driving some of these companies and some of these regions to begin having labor issues in their seafood sector. So there's increasing market demand, which is putting a traditionally low margin industry under increasing pressure from labor costs and other kind of cost savings perspectives. We also have flat or somewhat declining fisheries across many of these regions of the world. And in fact, aquaculture, which is actually a really great and growing part of supporting global food production, is also in many ways part of this issue, because they will source the feed that they are using for the farmed fish from the ocean. There's legality issues with how they're doing that, as well as the labor practices that are involved that have been explored in the last decade. And because there is such a thin margin and there's not a lot of support in a lot of these regions for improvement, there really is not a lot of ability to change, but we would also argue that because there hadn't been historically a real big spotlight on this region, and also seafood is harvested in many cases outside of sight on vessels that are operating with little monitoring, there was not historically a lot of incentive to change. I'm going to tell a story that's hopefully a little bit positive about how that is changing very rapidly in the last 10 years. The lack of guidance and capacity for remediation, I sort of just touched on. People didn't know what the issues were, what their responsibilities were, how to navigate some of those challenges related to jurisdictional issues, because on the high seas, the authorities are not always clear on labor issues, as well as seafood sustainability. And there was not a consistent international approach to addressing some of these challenges. We also, of course, deal with, as many, pretty much all of these sectors, there are issues with poverty and discrimination as well that are underlying the treatment of workers in some regions, as well as specifically affecting a lot of migrant workers. And then the part that I actually work on directly is the lack of data. And so this is a result, as I said, of some of these complex supply chain issues. So the way that this is starting to evolve within the seafood space, a lot of this work has been going on, of course, for decades to start addressing these issues. But about 10 years ago, and increasingly throughout the last decade, there have been exposés, media pressure, increasing public awareness of the links between unfair and abusive labor practices within seafood and the actual products that line the shelves of retailers like those that we work with. And these have served to motivate quite a bit of action on the part of industry, but it also has pointed out that industry members like retailers and their suppliers have a direct role in addressing these issues and cannot wait for governments in the world to solve these problems for them. So they've been coming to Fishwise and other organizations like ourselves for guidance, as largely as a result of realizing the scope and scale of these issues and needing more clarity on next steps. Another motivator of a lot of work in this space in the last few years has been increasing WROs, withhold release orders, for fishing commodities. So we're not seeing as many in the seafood sector as we might have seen in others, but it is increasingly happening, and it's getting attention and motivating government action as well in our field. And then lastly, I would say we are catching up in terms of guidance and best practice within our space. Seafood was long a sector that had a lot of exemptions applied to it. And because of those exemptions, the practices and guidance and work was just delayed compared to some of these other commodities that are associated with slave labor and abuse. And so in the last few years, there's been a heck of a lot of work across many different organizations to begin giving companies the tools that they need to actually know how to implement responsible practices for human rights, and also to provide them with examples and learnings from across the field of success stories, because we were very light on success stories when a lot of these exposés were going on. So we didn't have an example of what good work in this space really looked like. So this slide is busy. I'm not going to ask you to read the fine print, but essentially what it is it's showing how these different icons, the hooks are producers, which is what we call fishers or aquaculture producers. Then there's processors are the pink dots, and suppliers are the green dots, and retailers and brands are the blue dots. And basically what you see before you is that there are different needs and different activities that these different stakeholders have. And so we're beginning to parse what guidance and what next steps related to technology, but also related to best practice in labor exist across these different types of stakeholders. And that, level of granularity is really essential in a complex supply chain and global supply chain industry like seafood. So I will get into some of these things a bit more, but I'm going to carry on. What I'd really like to talk about today, and I think one of the things I can speak best to, is I'm not actually a labor expert. So we have a social responsibility division at Fishwise, and those staff are the ones that work closely on labor directly with the companies and the global communities that we collaborate with at Fishwise. My role as traceability division director is really to think about how information needs to flow in order to facilitate our social responsibility team to have what they need to assess risk, to identify opportunities for improvement. And so I really do take more of a data centric perspective on this, which isn't reflective of how all of our team think. But I think one of the things we all can understand is it's very difficult to advise on next steps without the information about where your risks and vulnerabilities really are. So I'm going to start with just telling you a little bit about some tech platforms that can be sort of the low-hanging fruit. And I know we're low on time. So RISE is I'm going to go over this really quickly because we are low on time. RISE is the roadmap for improving seafood ethics, which is a platform for industry that walks them through the steps that they need to take to improve labor practices within their supply chains. And so it is platforms like RISE, and I will share the link after this session. They are what I call low-hanging fruit, because essentially the first step in getting industry to take action is empowering them to know what that action is. So platforms like this and others that we can talk about more really are that first step in at least making sure that everyone understands what social responsibility in seafood looks like, provides resources for them to connect to other companies, provides guidance based on ILO and other conventions that spell out what their legal and ethical obligations are. So that's a first step in terms of technologies that can support this issue. Then there are other technologies such as basic traceability in platforms and tools. Those are about sharing information throughout the different stakeholders that are part of these webs of seafood supply chains. So just like Alex was talking about how complex labor and recruitment supply chains, if you want to use that term, really look like, the products in global seafood industry are traveling through a web of stakeholders, all of whom need to collect information about their own workers and the conditions within their operations, in addition to the products that they're buying and selling and trading. So it does get incredibly complicated without technology to assist. I already mentioned SALT. This is essentially a slide that overviews some of the principles that we've worked to create in that group with respect to the topic of the day. These are relevant because, again, they are about traceability as a tool to collect information on the economic, environmental, and social responsibility of seafood, and therefore they're useful for thinking about these issues together instead of trying to have parallel infrastructure and parallel data systems to collect similar but not identical information for two different purposes. This model is a way of bridging those things together, and that in and of itself is a cost saver and is driving adoption and uptake within government. And lastly, and I know I need to wrap it up, we have novel and emerging technologies that really build on historically used technology for oversight and monitoring of fishing. So things like vessel monitoring systems, things like satellite trackers, AIS beacons, all of these things that go on fishing vessels or satellites and things that we already have out there in the world. We are now investigating new ways to use artificial intelligence and big data databases to pool that data and use it for the purposes of monitoring time spent at sea and those sorts of activities, which have a direct impact on workers, because if a vessel has been at sea for over a year, it's a much higher risk situation for those workers that are on board. There are other types of tools as well, just even standardizing the way that we talk about data or use the actual, as we mentioned, the KDEs, standardizing the way that we're capturing information across supply chains lets us speak the same language and therefore understand where the risks are better, so that things like just not having compatibility between what we're asking for don't get in the way of actually being able to use information and identify risks. So with that, I will just conclude that I have some lessons learned here from each of these different efforts, but I'm going to go ahead and conclude there, and I can answer some more questions about how each of those different strategies of building support for private sector action have played out in our experience in the last few years. But thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you for that very interesting and in-depth presentation and highlighting what are some really key goals and some key issues too, like being able to assess risk with very limited data sets. We have some very complex analytical tools, and one of the challenges is being able to collect accurate, useful data from reliable sources, and then what do we do with that data is very, very important. So we'll be looking for more information down the road. Again, because this is all remote discussion, we decided to boil this down to an hour and a half, though you can see we have a lot of material that could go on for a couple day seminar, maybe someday in the future. Perhaps what I'll do is just pull up a couple of quick slides. Emily or Bernadette, if you could, from my presentation, I'll just give one or 2 minutes about that, just to touch on our project. So just skipping to the second slide and then the third slide. To mention with the Global Trace project, if you can just skip down to the next one. We do have 4 partners that are engaged in our effort. So we're focused on improving traceability in global supply chains to eliminate child labor and forced labor, with a focus on cotton in Pakistan and cobalt in the DRC. For the DRC, RCS Global and RMI are engaging on the ground for us in the DRC. And DigiNex is helping us develop the tools, traceability tools for cotton in Pakistan. And the Global Fund is assisting with dissemination. I'd say stay tuned. We've got this website that's coming up in early next year where we're going to start populating with more information about the project and what we're doing. If you could skip to the second slide or the next slide. Yeah, and this is just sort of maps it out. We have these 3 sets of outputs. the traceability methodology, the traceability tools, and the dissemination, which includes really engaging with academics and other experts in the fields, such as Fishwise, Cornell, and the ILO, to enhance our ability to have effective traceability tools. Now, with no further ado, I want to turn it over to Jason, who's going to give us a dose of realism with some good practical concerns. So Jason, if you're able to share your presentation, that'd be great.
Okay, how's that? Okay, I should call it dose of realism. Just kidding. All right, so I'm at Cornell University, and I work there as part of a project that's focused on the New Conversations Project. It's focused on what data and analysis of data about work along global supply chains tells us about what works in apparel, what works in fishing, and works on a large scale. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk a lot about fishing. Most of the examples come from work I did before coming to Cornell. I was the head of an ILO project in Bangkok called Ship to Shore Rides. But I'll start by talking first about what our findings are in the project on private regulation generally. And by private regulation, I mean CSR, responsible business conduct, voluntary private schemes of labor governance. And I'll talk too about what national governments are doing, but I'll focus on private regulation because they're still driving the conversation. And a lot of what we know about private regulation and its successes, its failures over the last 25, 30 years come from an analysis that my partner in the project, Sarosh Kuravila, published earlier this year. So by way of background, I'll tell you what we've learned about private regulation schemes in the aggregate, and then I'll talk about fishing. And I'll talk about forced labor, and I'll talk about technologies specifically. So in Sarosh's analysis, which is based on new data available to us from global brands and retailers, most of them in the apparel or home goods sectors, and global audit firms, that data was used for an analysis of progress over time. Progress in improvements in working conditions and protection of labor rights, usually in tier 1. So we have data from 40,000, one set includes data from 40,000 audits, data on labor violations, audit by audit, factory by factory. And this covers at least a dozen countries and as many different sectors. But the data it's a lot of apparel and it's a lot of China. What we found there, what Sarosh found, is that over this 6-year period, you see in the graph here, over this 6-year period, the number of violations identified in audits, and these are relatively high quality audits. As you know, there's a wide spectrum. In that 6-year period, the average number of audits went up a little, went down a little, went up, went down, but overall went nowhere. And this means to us that in the aggregate, these CSR programs, these private regulation schemes, this cycle of code, audit, remediation, are not delivering changes for workers. That doesn't describe every company, obviously. There is some good work going on out there. But on the whole, the data reveals that there's little or no progress for workers, despite the enormous investment. And one of the reasons is what Sarosh in the book calls opacity, the inability of people in the business and those of us on the outside looking in, inability to see what's going on. And one of the contributors to the opacity is bad data. Audits sometimes include fraudulent information, hours data, wages data that is cooked up for the purposes of the audit. There's corruption amongst auditors and factory management. There's a whole system best developed probably in China, and there's evidence in the book about how well oiled that machine is to deceive auditors and thereby buyers, retailers, and brands about working conditions at the factory. And in this analysis, in the top two countries in this data set, China and India, somewhere between 50 and 60% of audits are deemed unreliable. That is, they're not providing an accurate picture of working conditions at the factory level. That number astonished me. I've worked in fishing and apparel and other sectors for 20 years and found that even I was surprised by that. And turning to forced labor, one of the struggles of audits or intelligence gathering schemes and of CSR more generally is that it can't get a fix on some of the abuses, some of the factory level abuses, some of the supply chain abuses that are hard to see and hard to count. We use in the book the example of freedom of association because it takes some digging, some local knowledge, some savvy and patience on the part of auditors to get to the bottom of the relationship between workers and their union, between unions and employers. And as a result, freedom of association is rarely identified at the workplace level as a violation. Not because there aren't violations of freedom of association, they're widespread, but because they're relatively hard to see and hard to count. And despite the fact that freedom of association appears pretty high on the list of things that retailers and brands say they care about, they really don't. We can argue about that in the Q&A, but the same goes for forced labor, child labor, discrimination. Those rank higher for brands and retailers. They're more anxious about those things, but they're almost equally hard to see and hard to count. So let me talk now about fishing, how forced labor is identified in fishing, and this comes chiefly from my work in Southeast Asia, but also work that the New Conversations Project has done since, some of it with the ILO, including a review of existing forced labor identification tools. That's in a paper that I hope will be coming out soon. So whether you're a company or a national government, you're a company with a code of conduct, or you're the Thai government or the Peruvian government, you're trying to get a handle on forced labor problem in your fishing industry, you start first with the legal framework. And in many places in fishing, the legal framework is very, very weak. It doesn't speak to fishing, or fishers are lumped in with other agricultural workers. It's treated as largely informal. So national law is probably where you'd start in identifying the level of risk. And then as you begin to try to patch holes in your national legal framework, you could turn to P29, Protocol 29, the forced labor protocol that Alex mentioned at the top. And in fishing, a relatively boiled down and specific ILO convention, the Working Fishing Convention 188, which is 10, 12, maybe 15, going on 15 years old now, and is getting a little pickup of late, but also a tool of use to both private regulation and national governments as they try to pull labor law across the water and provide some measure of protection for fishers. And then, of course, private and voluntary codes of conduct produced by individual Mars, for example, Costco, Tesco, and others, and they're joined in multi-stakeholder initiatives that are pushing together codes that'll apply across the industry. That's the high-level stuff. And then you need to figure out whether you're a retailer or a regulator. You have to figure out what the appropriate measures of risk are, and how you can measure remotely what the level of risk is by fishery or by port, and then ultimately by vessel. And there are lots of tools developed for 1 and 2, lots of tools for private regulation schemes. There are codes, there are benchmarks, and increasingly measures of of risk. But what's missing is are tools that allow frontline actors to identify forced labor. So there's a big investment on 1 and 2 and a relatively small investment on 3. And I think that's in part because it's expensive, relatively expensive to get to the port, to get to the vessel, to find these fishers, and to get them to answer questions about protection of labor rights, working conditions, debt, recruitment schemes, et cetera. So probably an overinvestment on 1 and 2 and an underinvestment on number 3. And in the paper, and in work we're doing now, we look at some of the identification tools and some of the clearest and most detailed. One of them, I'm sort of tooting my own horn here. One is the ILO ship-to-shore rights tool, which was used for worker surveys, and that's published at the back of the reports that the ILO published under that project. Verite has also done a lot of work in this area, and typically publishes their tool, their survey tool. And then finally, there's the ITF, which is the Global Union for Transport Workers. That includes all things maritime and fishers. And they have developed a tool that they use to identify forced labor and other abuses in fishing. And so those are the extant tools. On the right of the screen there, you'll see a new tech tool. And I use that not as, I present it there not as an endorsement of that tool, but as an example of sort of tech tools that are in development and how difficult it can be when you're trying remotely with an IVR or a phone app to get workers to tell a story about working conditions. It's, as you can see in the example there, it can be pretty clunky. Making an identification of forced labor is not a paint by numbers thing. And in our experience, it's generally done, it's best done face-to-face, and it's between fishers, often vulnerable, in Thailand, vulnerable migrant workers from Myanmar or Cambodia. Best done in conversation with people they know and trust, and not through a phone app. There's very little data available to us about, as researchers, very little data available to us about the uses of these apps and how workers are responding and how companies are in turn handling those complaints. There's a real paucity of data on this. So I contrast those remote digital tools with the oldest tool in the world, conversation, and efforts by workers to organize themselves and work their way into a bargaining position. This is the point of worker organizations. And there's for me anyway, based in my work on the field, a real gap between workers' organizations, which are able to get workers into, to be actors, and worker voice technologies, which invite workers as consumers to share with somebody. Could be a regulator, could be a brand, they don't know. Aspects, sometimes intimate aspects of their work lives. Just quickly, how are we doing for time, Jeff? Oh, all right. I'm going to dash through this. These are things that Sarah. These are tools that Sarah mentioned. This is a shot from the Global Fishing Watch. It's a powerful tool. This and other traceability tools tell us things we didn't know 10, 15 years ago about where fishing is happening and what the level of effort is, et cetera. These are traceability tools, and to know the source of the catch is crucial. You can't do any of the things we've been talking about, identifying or connecting fishers with buyers, and buyers attempting to remediate problems for fishers who are 5 or 6 steps away along their supply chains, or for others, outsiders, to hold brands and retailers in their assumption of this role as private regulators of their industry, hold them accountable for what's happening 5 and 6 steps away in their supply chain. So this tool is a powerful example of the traceability technology. But again, the ability to trace the catch and identify all the intermediaries along a supply chain is just a preliminary to the real action, which is identifying, for somebody like me, identifying the the labor conditions, the working conditions, the risk of abuses, actual abuses, and then the hard part, solving it, fixing it. So there's lots of talk about traceability, and it's often confused with, it's a tool. It's often deemed the solution. If we can just trace the supply chain, we'll be able to solve all these problems. If we can just introduce blockchain, then we'll be able to end slave labor. It's for people inside the business, this is nonsense, but it's these equivalencies have gained some currency over the last few years, and there's a lot of cleaning up to be done in the debate inside the industry about what the problem is and how it gets solved. It's too pat to turn labor abuses and their prevention and their remediation into a traceability problem. It's just step one. So 2 quotes on the slides here from a former ocean mind analyst who's working with the Thai government and others to figure out how you use technology to identify the risk, to trace the product, and to identify risk so that a regulator or a company or a union, if they have access to the data, can get in there and make a determination about forced labor. So I've boiled down at the bottom there what I think are the things that we really need in terms of data. The data has to be relevant. So if it's data about process or inputs, it's not meaningful. It doesn't get us to outcomes and impacts. So it has to be relevant data on things like pay schemes and actual wages. It has to be accurate. Maybe that goes without saying. And there has to be access to data, not just by the people inside the scheme, but those on the outside who are wanting to help and part of the accountability for these private regulation schemes. And then comes something like blockchain. I'm not a technologist, so I don't understand all the uses of blockchain, but you have to have those first 3 in place before something like blockchain has any value. I'm probably running long, so I won't talk about these slides. Here's where national governments come into the picture. They often get, dashed past as private regulation schemes attempt to solve problems by themselves, and not without reason. Governments have long ignored problems in fishing, but some governments are getting into the act, and the South African government is one. They ratified one of the early ratifiers of Convention 188, and they took 188, and if you're familiar with it, you can see it in that slide there. They took 188 and wrote some of its provisions into the inspection tool that they're using for port state inspection, meaning they're checking out 188 requirements for foreign flag vessels putting into South African ports, and famously in our little circle identified a Taiwanese fishing vessel put in a South African port 3 or 4 years ago, and held it for several days under suspicion that there was forced labor and other problems. So probably the first example, and possibly still the only example of a government holding another foreign flag vessel over forced labor violations.
This could be a good point for us to tie it up. I know we're running short on time.
Yeah, well, Jeff, just this last one. So all the things that I've talked about, the legal framework, the tech tools, et cetera, don't mean a lot unless there is in general, in my experience, a trade partner willing to engage the other government and its industry over practices, and to issue credible incentives or credible threats to the trade relationship, until labor abuses are dealt with. So the blank there in the title of that slide means anything you like from the list above, plus trade leverage, is when the real conversations start.
Great, thank you very much. Raising important questions about the relevancy, accuracy, and accessibility of the data. And what we have is a fundamental problem of a lack of organized worker voice around the world in many industries. And then this issue of what the role of government is in the trade relationship is good. So I want to tee this up to Janice. There's a lot for you to go at. You can tackle whatever issue that you want to do. Anything you want, because there's so much you could unpack there.
I'll try to do it quickly. In saying that, I would like to say that, when you, as a teacher, some of the people in the school are teachers, you always wonder who your audience is and how much they know. Some people here are very knowledgeable, but I'm not sure everyone is. So I I just want to hit a few points to make sure. Looking at this topic, it really fascinates me because when I teach it and you use the word forced labor, students sort of look at you and then they use the word human trafficking as if it's something different, which it isn't, just a trendy name now. But I look at it and I look at Convention 29 as perhaps, and it is a fundamental principle of the ILO because it is absolutely fundamental. I consider it the first human rights convention of the ILO. Some of you may know that in 1926, the League of Nations adopted an instrument on slavery, and the ILO, which was separate, but started to look at this more carefully. And they took a much broader view than what we sometimes mean, or many people mean by slavery, and came up with Convention number 29, adopted in 1930. I think it's the most eloquent, succinct, yet totally comprehensive definition. It's almost timeless. Because it recognizes this human rights issue that working people have autonomy. They may be in desperate economic situations and have to accept crappy jobs, let's be blunt, but they do have a right to know the deal and decide of their own free will whether they will agree to the deal. And they have the right that that deal should be honored by the other side. So for those of you who don't know it, I'm going to read it real fast, the definition. The term forced or compulsory labor shall mean all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which that person has not offered himself voluntarily. So that's what I mean about you have free will and you have a right to say yes or no. And that is so key, I think, when we think about forced labor. So over the years, there's been obviously an evolving recognition of different manifestations of forced labor. From a lawyer's viewpoint, and I'm a lawyer, the first question is what types of behavior are prescribed by this? Today, I mean, in the last 30 years, I think we've been much more sensitive to this question of what does it mean to have service exacted under menace of penalty? And the classic one, especially with so much migration in the last 2 or 3 decades, is taking persons from one country into another, taking their passport, threatening them or their family members in the home country that they'll be harmed if the person doesn't just shut up and do as they're commanded. And Alex mentioned debt bondage, which is a term we don't use in the United States, but it's so common that if somebody's being moved from one country to another, they have to pay for their passage at sometimes outrageous fees. But also, sometimes to pay for that, they might use the family farm as collateral. And so if they can't pay it back, the family loses everything. It's unbelievable. And the second aspect of them is how do you detect violations? I can remember some years ago I was at the ILO and I sort of was sitting in the back listening to the statisticians talk about child labor. And what they said really struck me, that once something is made unlawful, it becomes much more difficult to detect it because unscrupulous persons are going to be very careful about disguising what's going on. So that's part of the challenge which our speakers today were talking about. And it is an incredible challenge. So we were talking about global supply chains, and that certainly is very important. And I will get back to it at the end. But I want to say forced labor is a problem in advanced countries. And sometimes we don't realize it. The UK in the past few years enacted a statute called the Modern Slavery Act, really great title, to capture people's attention that things were going on in the UK that had maybe people didn't notice, but it was a manifestation of forced labor. For us, it's obvious that undocumented immigrants are particularly vulnerable to exploitation, and they are, as unscrupulous persons know, they are the least likely to report their predicament to the authorities. So some action points for all of us. Can forced labor be happening in your neighborhood? Would you see it? Do you notice sullen people, but the sullen workers who look very quiet, perhaps a bit frightened, usually in very low-level jobs? You ever wonder why? I'll give one quick one. Within the past, about 5 years ago, in case in Philadelphia, Walmart, but it was a cleaning crew that went into Walmart when the Walmart place was closed in the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. And this subcontracted group came in to clean. Turned out they were Ukrainian, they were undocumented immigrants, they were forced labor. They were basically locked in a house and not being paid. And they were cleaning. And the only way this was discovered was one night when they went in to do this, there were some other workers doing repair work, maybe electrical workers, and one cleaner was able to indicate to that other worker that what the situation was, and this worker called the police. It went to federal court. But that was right here in Philadelphia at a Walmart. Who would think that? So that's for all of us to be on the alert. For all companies, management, the procurement staff, are they really looking at this issue of where the product is coming from? Now, we will talk today about where it's coming from, but is your procurement staff really looking at this? And you know the case of those farm workers who were picking tomatoes in Florida. That led to the coalition of, and I hope I'm saying this right, Immokalee workers. But in other words, some of them were undocumented immigrants, basically locked up in trailers and out to pick tomatoes. But when you go to your supermarket, how do you know where the tomato comes from? But that's a long domestic supply chain. And it was being done. So your procurement staff may be looking for the cheapest tomatoes, but did they ever ask how come? How can that company be doing it so cheaply? For employers' top management, consider whether you are demanding what you're demanding of your supplier is possible. If your supplier is not contravening Convention 29 and the protocol. One of my favorite cases I use with students involved Apple with the iPhone 5, where they had, like Apple always wants to launch a new product, you know, about the month before Christmas. But in this case, the design was running late. But they still wanted to launch it before Christmas, have it on the shelves like around Thanksgiving. They're pushing their Malaysian supplier that you have to do this, you have to meet this deadline, even though we're giving you the design late. And 50,000 workers would be needed in Malaysia. Like from where? How would they find this out? And as you would guess, all sorts of terrible things happened, and they met the deadline, by the way, but the workers got abandoned in Malaysia, didn't get the pay they expected, couldn't afford to get home, didn't have their passports, and by the way, they were afraid of losing the family farm. That was Apple. So I look at it and say, did Apple top management at any time think about how their supplier would be able to meet their deadline? Did anyone ask about the workforce? So it's a new way of thinking. Well, we've talked about global supply chains and this, and I particularly enjoy. Yesterday, I was walking down the street in Center City, Philadelphia, and saw a restaurant that sells a seafood restaurant and also sells it and said traceability. And I was really pleased. Oh, somebody in Philadelphia is concerned about this. And then I came back and read one of the slides and said, yes, we can trace it back to its origin, but can we verify what happened on that boat? So the challenge is really there. And for us as consumers, Jason, I think, mentioned Thailand. I was in a place in Thailand where the tuna gets put into the can, if I could put it so bluntly. But I was talking to one of their managers there who said about American consumers, they want really cheap tuna fish, cheaper than most countries in Europe do. How do you think we can produce cheap tuna fish? And for all of you, I hope you all know that the three largest tuna fish, were the cans you see in the supermarket, Bumblebee, Chicken of the Sea, and Starkist, are all owned. They're not American companies anymore. One is Thailand TUF, one is from Taiwan, and one is from South Korea. So it's a long global supply chain. So what can we do? Well, obviously, what I'd say is get U.S. employers, particularly the government. Now, governments change in this country, so their support can change from one administration to the next. And of course, workers will, to support an ILO convention on global supply chains. It's really important. We need something more specific, not just about forced labor, child labor, et cetera, in this issue. And finally, my final thing, and I think this is super important, get U.S. free trade agreements to contain an enforcement clause that penalizes those companies who violate these rights, such as violating the Forced Labor Convention. So I'd point to, and it's the first one, the model of the USMCA, which for those of you, it's the new NAFTA. There's an enforcement clause. And basically, there's one path you can follow, which has always been the path where you go to the offending government and say, please do better. There's a new enforcement that says, no, we're going to target the specific company that's alleged to be violating things. And if they're found to have violated, that company gets deprived of the benefits of the free trade agreements, especially like the reduced tariffs. That's an effective penalty, very effective, and it targets only the wrongdoers, and it sends a strong message to other companies in the same industry. So of course we have to identify them.
We've hit 1:30.
Yeah, we have to identify those wrongdoers, and that's what today's speakers have been saying. So I think if we could identify them and we could get these changes in our free trade agreements, maybe we could have some real impact.
Hey, Jeff, I think we can go over about another 5 minutes. So if you want to take some Q&A now, that would be great.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. It's a very rich and interesting discussion. We're just going to have further sessions down the road so we can unpack some more of this, which is great. And hopefully we'll be able to do something in person. So there were a few questions. I'll try to just tee up a couple of them. We're going to have to miss some of them. There, for example, were a couple of questions for Alex, like from Mindy. Where does any training or education for new occupational roles come in for workers recruited in developing countries for high volume recruitments? Are there some positive models here that we can look at?
Thanks for this question, Jeff. So in terms of training for workers, I mean, the question is about from who, right? Who are the actors? So I think, I mean, there's different levels. Many countries have, for example, pre-departure trainings related to specific occupations. Some of them are quite general, and in fact, we realize when speaking with employers on the other side that they don't really meet the needs, especially in terms of skills. So it's often complemented by skills training, either by the recruiters in countries of origin. Many of them also provide that, or, you know, I would say on the job training when the worker arrive. So I think it's a complex set of training, governmental, recruiter, or on the job. And for the second question, sorry, linked to volume deployment, can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, occupational roles come in for workers recruited in developing countries for high volume recruitments, and are there some positive models there?
High volume recruitment is a key challenge because, as I said, we've seen that it's a bit, you know, if you want high volume, it's often in a quick period of time. And so it means that often you have to lower your standards because you have to recruit quickly a high volume. It will mean that you will use more sub-agents to recruit. You might be, you know, forced to use also some techniques that are fraudulent to convince people to get the job. So what we're saying is to employers is often try to anticipate as much as possible the recruitment needs so that you can plan it in an adequate manner, give sufficient time to labor recruiters to recruit in a fair way. Because yeah, high volume, quick deployment is often counterproductive.
Great.
You know, I just add, Jeff, those are both red flags. If your industry says, I need lots of workers and I need them yesterday, you've got a dysfunctional labor market in your destination country. You've got a bigger problem. And
it's similar to the pressures that we see in industry, which is give us your orders now, even if you have to subcontract it out and have forced overtime. I want to just give an opportunity to all the speakers if there's any kind of burning issue or loose end that you'd like to tie up very quickly before we close in a couple of minutes. Sarah, Jason, Alex.
Can I highlight one? And it's Jason has it in the chat. And this is not to denigrate people in corporate social responsibility because they do important work. But Jason says they often really are not in the, like, it's sort of like the company saying, oh, we have CSR, but where's the power structure? right? And so that was one of my points about Apple. You need people at the top to at least have the concern, and then delegate people in the company to deal with it. And that's where I think we really have to hit. And it's what Alex was saying. When Apple knew it needed 50,000 people, what did the people at the top do? Didn't think about it at all. So that's where you're going to get action. So we have to, all of us, work to make people at the top.
Thank you. And just very quickly, any other final points, Sarah, Alex, or Jason?
I don't have anything too much, but I just wanted to echo that I think the point that Jason made about the role of traceability is so key. And so when we're trying to define, what's needed and how technology can really support the issue of social responsibility and combating forced labor, it's good to remember that these are just data. It's all about having the information at your fingertips. It does not mean that everyone knows what to do with that information. And in fact, more isn't always better. Sometimes fewer and more actionable is the way to go. So just happy that we all seem to be coming to that conclusion through our different angles on these issues. And I think it's a really hopeful space though. Actually, at this point, there's so much, this is a really ripe time for technology to really come in and assist in what ways it can. So some optimism on my side about where we're headed.
That could be a good way of a place for us to end it. So Emily and Bernadette, some people were asking about the availability of the presentations. And then also I know we are recording it and it'll be made available. Is that through the LERA website?
That's through the DC LERA website. We'll have it there, Jeff, and I'll work with Emily and Bernadette to get the presentations and the recording, the full recording up. But I really want to thank you for organizing this. Fantastic job. Thank you, Alex, Sarah, Jason, Dr. Palacci, former president of LERA National. Really appreciate you guys for jumping on here, and Kevin Cassidy for hosting these meetings. And again, everyone, please join DC LERA. We have a fascinating chapter. We deal with all the big international issues, and this was one of the best presentations I've ever experienced through DC LERA. And it's one of the upsides of our Zoom time, that we're able to get people from all over the country, all over the world to participate in these conversations. And so I really appreciate you folks joining us today. Jeff, any last word you want to have?
No, except does anybody want to put in a very quick plug for the next National LERA Conference?
Yes, well, there's two. Emily, what's the date of the national, the academic conference in January? But that's...
So our January conference happens every year, the first week of January, and this year will be January 6th through 8th. That will be online. So, and it's a very low registration fee of like $65, $85. I cannot recall this year, but it actually has gone up a little bit, but not too much. And
That's
then
the
our
ASSA one.
Yeah.
So that's a ton of economists that come together, 13,000 economists, and LERA will have 18 full sessions at that meeting. And you're all welcome to register. The links are on our website. And then our June meeting will be June 2nd through 5th, 2022, also taking place virtually. So please, you're invited to register and attend that as well.
Great. So thank you all. Stay tuned, stay in touch. If you've got burning questions, let us know or let the speakers know directly. So thank you all again.
Yeah. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great Happy New Year. And we look forward to seeing you in 2022.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve.